one of the biggest concern is how long is this process going to take? And on a high level, the process is divided into two stages, including the first stage of making qualifying investment and the second stage of applying for E2 visa.
Bobby, if you could actually give us some details as to explaining what kind of factors are involved that could make the investment timeline vary among the investors, especially when it comes to the business model that they've selected.
Obviously, for every different type of business model, the amount of time it takes to establish a business to the point of viability and being able to apply for E2 visa is going to be different, such as a business that's a very simple service-based type of model could be fully established to the point of viability within a couple of months. On the other hand, if the business investment is in a retail-heavy retail space, physical premise, that might take a lot longer time to fully establish that retail premise before it is a viable business to apply for E2 visa, especially if the investment is in highly regulated areas such as food service, restaurants, health and safety, or childcare, or business involving transportation, alcohol, tobacco. Any kind of highly regulated business will drag out the business setup time because the licensing and permit typically is a more involved, complicated process. So those are all the variables that will affect how long it takes to start up, set up, and invest in a business and progress it to the point of being ready to apply for an E2 visa.
This is actually insight that I don't think people can find in a lot of places online. So I really appreciate you going into these details about other factors to consider when making the investment, especially when it comes to the business model, because from our experience, I remember seeing cases where the client had selected a business, usually it was restaurant business, that required renovation and build outs, and that increased the investment process by another 3 to 6 months before we could apply for the E2 visa. What other reasons should investors really consider when it comes to E2 timeline so that they could better coordinate the logistics of what they're doing?
So it's really important for the prospective E2 investor to think about that in advance, especially for the investor with children who are school age and need to think about getting the visa in time for the kids to start school in the United States. Typically, school year begins in August or September. So if there's a time urgency, a timeline that needs to be adhered to, then the business selection should be one that's not going to involve a very lengthy, complex business setup. So that should be taken into account.
So let's go into that second stage now, the E2 process. We've just gone over the first stage, which is the investment portion of the E2 timeline. The second stage of the E2 timeline is the submission of the actual E2 application. Normally, when most people are asking about how long will the process take, how long does it take to get my E2 visa, when will this be done, this is usually the stage that they're referring to is how long, once my application is submitted, when will I get my E2 visa? And the answer is it really varies. It depends on where you're applying. There's different factors involved. Bobby, I'd really love for you to go into some of the details as to what factors are involved that affect the processing timeline once the application is submitted.
The second stage of the application process, whether to apply for the E2 visa with the U.S. Embassy versus applying for change of status. Once the application is submitted, typically the immigration authorities, U.S. Embassy, will take a period of time to review the documents. That period of time will vary depending on the embassy, depending on how busy they are, depending on their personnel resources. So it could range anywhere from 1 to 3 months, typically, in most cases. During COVID, it was all over the place, and it could stretch out far beyond that. Some people who have come from countries where the U.S. Embassy is taking excessive amount of time to process E2 visa, probably far longer than the typical 1 to 3 months range. A case in example is the U.S. Embassy in Colombia, for example. They're taking like more than a year, maybe 2 years to adjudicate an E2 visa. So for folks that are coming from countries where the US Embassy is taking undue amount of time to process E2 visa, then it may be not only appropriate, but necessary to apply for a change of status to E2, maybe using an expedited processing so that the investors could acquire E2 status sooner, be able to start operating the business far sooner, and get their kids in school and start living their life in the United States. So there's a lot of evaluation, strategizing in terms of deciding exactly where to apply that is appropriate for the investor, him or herself.